Shall I? Okay. So are we ready for me to start screen sharing now? I'm just going to do it. Which one? Okay. And we're ready to kick off, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome to this second webinar, reporting research from the Building Migrant Resilience in Cities, Immigration et Résilience en Milieu Urbain Partnership. Today, we're going to hear about recent research concerning the resilience of international students. We have three presenters today. First, Professor Chedley Balodia from Concordia University, who will be speaking in French about the welcome extended to international students in Montreal. Then we will hear from Professor Cristina Gabriel from Concordia University, who will report on recent evidence regarding student resilience. And finally, we have Mr. Sohail Shahinia from Ryerson University, who will talk about some of the challenges of studying international students. So we will have three presentations today, followed by a few remarks, and then we will have time for questions and answers. We'd ask that everybody please turn off the sound on your phones and mute yourselves, and put any questions that you have in the chat as we go along, and we will gather those up at the end and bring them in for our presenters, if that's okay. So with no more ado, I would like to invite Professor Balodia to speak, and he will present on Montreal, his research there.
Okay, merci, Tara, thank you. So I guess I will thank you for inviting me to this webinar, and I will present work that we conducted over the last few years in Montreal with Amel Gerbi, who's also with us today. She's a student finishing her PhD thesis at l'INRS in Montreal. So I will share my screen. Tara, you mentioned I will speak in French, but I think I'm going to speak in English because I prepared my PowerPoint, which, sorry, I have to. Am I sharing it or? Share screen, where is it?
Sorry, and while these slides are being prepared, I've just been reminded to remind everybody that this session is being recorded today.
Okay, so you have my presentation?
Yes, Chedley, it needs to be
correct.
made full screen.
Yes, it is now. Okay, so we've worked, today what we're going to present is what we call the outline maybe of a future chapter. Based on the research that was conducted in 2018, and that was also published in a special issue of Journal of International Mobility. I could share I think it's on, we can have access to this research, but in this research on Montreal, questioning Montreal as a welcoming city, we've discussed this in our paper, and the outline of the chapter is really what is in the paper that we wrote, but we will now, you know, with the changes in the last 2-3 years, we will add maybe a discussion piece to the chapter. So it would look a bit like this. So really branding, I want today really in the time that I have, it would be to address maybe these points. Branding Montreal, defining what we mean by welcoming city or a welcoming community, and giving you a few insight of the results that we found in the research. This research was mainly conducted by Amel, and I hope she will also be, I mean, Amel, feel free to join, or during the question period, we will be able to converse on this. So branding Montreal, briefly, we know that Montreal has been promoted as a city open for international students, a city where it's il fait bon étudier, a city that really wants to keep also its international students, a city that has been ranked over the year as the best city in North America for students. So there's been a lot of discourses, a lot of different stakeholders also pushing this brand, from the city of Montreal to agencies such as Montréal International, but also when we look at the media coverage of Montreal and the way we promote the city, I think it's a starting point to our piece, so that we see Montreal really as a welcoming city for international students, based on quality of life, cost of living, the fact that you have many post-secondary institutions also that gives Montreal that flavor in the North American market, and also even globally. We know also that, and this is the work that maybe Amel has been doing more than myself, looking at the concentration of international students in downtown Montreal. Montreal has the main universities, the main campuses are located downtown, and also we are aware that there is a concentration of international students around universities, and that really influences the urban dynamics also of these neighborhoods in Montreal. This is another way of illustrating the density, I would say, of the neighborhoods where you have the universities, and you see a concentration also of students. So when we look brief numbers rapidly, top countries, India in 2019, when we look at the numbers, we see now India as the first country, 22%, France, China, and also, so you have really, what I want to say by this is India is something that popped up just recently. Normally, when we look at numbers and at data from a longer perspective, we will see that France is the dominant country, and it's been growing in Quebec and in Montreal. So a lot of students, international students, will come from France, but also China. When we look at the Anglophone universities, McGill, Concordia, we see also students from other, Iran, for example, also. So there's been a diversification also of international students in Montreal. What is interesting with India, just briefly, is that there's been an impressive growth of foreign students in colleges, and that has been also creating some controversies lately. We saw in the media with these colleges recruiting students with high cost for tuition fees, and also a pathway to a possible residency in Quebec. So, but it's been really a recent phenomenon in Quebec. Most of the foreign students, when we think of Quebec, are studying in Montreal, so it's really mainly a very concentrated urban situation. And the big four universities, there are other universities, but we see the big names: McGill, Université de Montréal, Concordia, and Université du Québec à Montréal. What we see also in Montreal is, we're in our paper, we set the stage by looking at this Les Deux Solitudes model, where Montreal, we know, has almost a division between Anglophone universities and also Francophone institutions. So Montreal, when we think of Montreal, mainly English-speaking universities that are characterized by national and international mobility. A lot of Canadian students will come to Montreal to study in these two institutions, and the French-speaking institutions, you see more mobility from Quebec moving to Montreal to study in Montreal. We see, so we can question this bilingual, there's this sense that it's very, it's the two solitude model, and it's still very present, but there's been also an increased diversity of foreign students in Montreal. So when we look at, I know in the paper we have data, I think, on languages, and the division between French and English has been also evolving with a lot of students with a capacity to be able to speak in French or English, and it's been so changing a bit the representation also of international students in Montreal. So Montreal as a welcoming community, in the paper, we presented, there's a broad literature on the concept. I'm not going to go in this, but we focused really on the notion of espace de frottement. I couldn't find really the exact translation for this, but I'm presenting this in entre guillemets, donc espace de frottement. So really looking at three key situation or places where we saw frottement, not confrontation, but tensions or spaces of tensions when we look at urban spaces, when we've looked at the mobilization and responsibilities of key actors, and also when we focus more on the international students themselves. So really from starting from maybe the concept of the welcoming community and the sense that we have a broad, we have a lot of work. There's been a lot of work on the indicators of what is a welcoming community. We've moved a bit from just looking at these indicators, but we've looked more at the dynamics of what happens really on the ground when we have international students in downtown Montreal. So to do this, there was a piece, an interesting piece at the beginning was participatory observation. Emel will maybe be more able to talk on this. She actually attended a lot of these meetings, la table de concertation du quartier Peter McGill, who's, I mean, it's a body that's really been involved in downtown Montreal, close to, I mean, when we talked about le secteur Peter McGill, le secteur between, I mean, Concordia and McGill, very dense, a lot of different population living this neighborhood. So there was a piece of observing what the table was working on, and also observing how the topic of immigration came in as an important topic to discuss. There was also a piece where Emel conducted 32 semi-structured interviews with key stakeholders and also foreign students living in downtown Montreal. Key results, I mean, three, maybe we would like to, in the paper, there's, I mean, broader analysis of these results. So what came out maybe was incoherence between la mise en scène des universités, the way we brand universities, and the harsh realities of foreign students navigating the city. And this can be seen in different sectors or different realities, such as housing, which is an important issue in downtown Montreal for students, and other issues such as identity, sense of feeling part of the city, part of what is Montreal. That also has been something that we saw in the interviews. There's also there is collaboration between key stakeholders, but it's still deficient. Sometimes there's a sense that the stakeholders tend to collaborate on making sure that the branding piece of Montreal is put forward, but really to understand and evaluate what really international students bring to the city. It's still lacking. And also by interviewing students, by understanding the feeling of students, there's a sense that there's feelings of invisibility of students in the city. That comes up from what they said, by the conditions that they are living in the city, by the lack of services, of integration sense, the sense of integration. That also has been an interesting result by discussing with the student. So final slide, just maybe to open the discussion where we want to go with our piece, is that we still want to question maybe the relation between universities and cities and go beyond the symbolic branding strategy of cities and universities, and cities, the way we see sometimes the way we present cities, where you have this dynamic such as Montreal. I think there's a lot of work on the role of universities, and we want to pursue this. What came out also in the research was also the students questioning if they would stay in Quebec, if they would stay in Montreal. So Montreal, a very welcoming city to come to study, but is it still welcoming when you want to stay? So the whole issue of retention, a lot of mobility of students leaving to other cities, leaving to other provinces mostly. And finally, I would go to the last one, and that's an interesting also. I find when we look at the way by doing the observation also of la table de concertation, I think it's interesting to question, to go further than just resilience, to look at maybe what we mean by a city that is hospitable to migrants, to different categories of migrants, which are, we could say, temporary forms of migration, so towards hospitality. I think there's interesting work also on the concept of hospitality, and this is also something we are bringing in the discussion, maybe going up, reading other work of authors, of scholars who are more interested in the dynamics of sharing, of constructing spatial proximity for different kind of populations. So I will stop here. I think I hope I didn't go further than 13 minutes. Merci beaucoup.
That was absolutely perfect timing. Thank you very much, Chedley, and a very interesting discussion. I'm going to move right on now to Christina to start with the next presentation. And I would like to again encourage people to put any questions or comments into the chat so that we can round up questions for all of the presenters once we've heard all three of the presentations.
Okay.
Okay, I'm just trying to look for my clock. All right, so first of all, thank you for the opportunity to share some of our findings and to receive some feedback from you about how our chapter should unfold. First of all, I should say I'm at Carleton and not Concordia. They're great people at Concordia. Would love to work with them, but I'm at Carleton. So I do want to say that that the chapter that we're trying to pull together is very much a collaborative effort. It brings together members from the International Student Working Group, including Margaret Walton-Roberts, Kitchener-Waterloo, Lisa Alfieri-Slayton at York Region, Francine Schlosser from Windsor, and Shutama Ghosh in Toronto, as well. And I'm drawing on the insights of Louisa Vronis as well. So in the chapter, what we are trying to do is to draw on these collaborative projects, as well as some of the insights from the research digests that have already been published, and more recently from the International Student webinar. So the starting point of the chapter is to think about the concept of social resilience. And at the moment, we're thinking about in relation, like a working definition that Akbar and Preston put out to think about the international student experience in Canada, And in doing so, we anticipate that we're going to have to work through some of the tensions that mirror some of our conversations in the partnership as a whole in terms of thinking about individual resilience, as well as, these broader conceptualizations of social resilience. So in order to sort of get ourselves thinking about this chapter and to think about how to proceed, we convened a meeting among the members in the different city networks. And in each instance, the members came to think about the international student experience, albeit from slightly different vantage points, which reflect their research. So my point here is the chapter is still part of an ongoing conversation. What I'm doing is presenting some of our initial thoughts. So in terms of the chapter, we're proposing to consider how student experience of migration governance and social supports moves across various scales to capture the dynamics of the different projects. And so, for instance, the research conducted touches on the transnational domain. It touches on the federal government's policy regime vis-a-vis international students, on individual universities and the role they play in hindering or fostering social resilience, and on the impact of the local community. So while we sort of capture these different dynamics, all the research projects are located in Ontario, the province with the highest number of students. But in Ottawa, our group also included both English and French-speaking students. So the way we proceeded with our conversation in terms of trying to flesh out this chapter was to take the questions posed as goals by the editors and try to add our thoughts or our initial thoughts about those questions. And that's how I've structured this talk, insofar as the talk reflects our conversation. So the first question asked about the merits of a resilience approach to settlement. And the question as posed might have to be reconsidered in terms of the group that we're talking about, insofar as international students have a precarious status. And while many of them may want to stay in Canada using a pathway such as the postgraduate work permit, others don't. And so that might be something to think about. But the other issue about international students' precarious status is that they're located at a set of very contradictory dynamics. So on the one hand, they're encouraged to come to Canada, even recruited actively to come to Canada as part of its two-step process, and they may want the status of a permanent resident. But the current institutional framework, or at least the governance framework of immigration regulations, for instance, works against them in many instances. For example, the work students do on campus is not always counted. And international students themselves might fall between the cracks in terms of support because they're unable to access existing settlement services. And local immigration partnerships may have long waiting lists. And some community agencies that provide services to international students do so, but they're not necessarily funded to do so. So the very status of international students is implicated in a broader framework of precarity. Similarly, the institutional framework is not always responsive, or not necessarily responsive to international students' concerns, and this has implications for the broader issue of resilience. So if you consider the recent announcement of the pathway to permanent residence for international students, and here I'm just highlighting some of the points the Migrant Rights Network has made based on a survey they did. The criteria still will exclude as many as 34% of their survey respondents on the basis of the fact the criteria, says you have to be graduated after a certain time, you have to have a certain level of education. You need an existing current work permit, and the broader issue of being ready with language accreditation. So those kinds of criteria push people out. If we turn to the second question posed by the editors, how do formal and informal institutions play a role here? One issue to consider is and because many of us did research within particular post-secondary institutions, is the extent to which those institutions step into the gap to provide some service. So, and here, whether it's on the basis of information regarding work permit or rules for work or health services on the one hand, but on the other hand, there are other kinds of issues that come to the fore. The federal government has rules as to what universities can or can't do vis-a-vis international students. There might also be, in terms of the way universities are set up, there might be differences that frame international students' experiences. So some of the research we've done here in Ottawa seems to suggest that students at Carleton might have greater issues regarding finances than students in Ottawa, and that might be something to look at. But the other point in respect to this question that's also important is to think of what types of civil society groups have also offered assistance. And here, certainly research in Kitchener-Waterloo indicates that some denominational churches and their parishioners have come to play a role. We can think about the extent to which international students themselves have made links in the communities that they're located in terms of just neighborliness. Your neighbors might help you. The third question, which is sort of related to the points I've just made about formal and informal institution, is the broader issue of the urban context. So obviously, students, even with precarious status, are members of broader communities and reliant on public goods. And research in Kitchener-Waterloo and Windsor raises the interesting point about the nature of a public infrastructure and how that plays a role in students' experiences. And the examples that they brought to the fore is just the issue of public transport, for instance. But also, there are students make calculated bargains. So certainly in Ottawa, some students might prefer to live on the Quebec side in Gatineau because the housing costs are cheaper. That leads to being at a further distance from the university, but that's a bargain. The last question asked about thinking about the merits of the resilience approach, including analysis of responses to COVID. So more broadly than that question, I think COVID was a wake-up call to educational institutions and the federal government as to how the system is so dependent on international students. So a recent report from Parliament said in 2018, there were 721,000 international students studying Canada, and they contributed 21.6 billion to the country's gross domestic product, which I think is not insignificant. So I think also COVID made visible the extent to which some post-secondary institutions are reliant on international students, and by extension, their contribution to the Canadian economy. But also, I think international students also provide skills and talent to the economy. So in some, as kind of, and this is as one of the members of the group put it, international students are often viewed as a remedy to all social and economic consequences, including those that stem from ill-planned government practices. And I thought that captured it nicely. So the ability of international students to navigate the ongoing pandemic is framed by the broader environment. Some supports are evident, but in many instances, those supports as constructed tended to overlook the specifics of international student experience. And there's some evidence to support that, both through the parliamentary committee's work, but also, for instance, in Ottawa, students reported, the ones that I was able to interview post-pandemic, that they were unable to access supports the government put in place because of the criteria, and that simply university emergency funds were not enough. So, and additionally, the government did move to allow students from abroad to continue with their studies remotely, but there were many disruptions. And there were also issues around, access to technology and the time when things were offered. The border and travel restrictions meant many students could not go home, or they could not come to Canada. And many students were delayed staying in Canada, and that's a financial hardship. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I think that is it. I think in relation to that last question, though, I think the COVID, the ongoing pandemic has made more visible the things that many of us already knew or suspected about the existing inequities that international students face while they're here in Canada. So I'm going to stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Gabrielle. That was a really great synopsis of the research that's been taking place, and I think a very real picture of what we see for sure in communities where we're working in them. I would now like to invite Sohail to present on the challenges of doing research among international students, and again, remind folks to put your comments and questions into the chat so we can come back to them at the end for all three of the presenters.
Hi all, and thank you, Tara, for a great introduction. I'm great to be here and to be among some of the great researchers. I'm just going to start by sharing my PowerPoint slides. Just as I'm doing this, just let me know if you guys are able to see the slides. So can you guys see my PowerPoint slides right now, or you guys?
I'm seeing myself in a PowerPoint view.
Okay.
So the PowerPoint and then do a screen share, please.
Let me...
If not, then I can do it.
Here we go. I think it's gonna work now. So are you guys able to see the PowerPoint?
I'm seeing a black screen.
So how, when you open up screen sharing, you'll see a whole bunch of little screens in front of you. Choose the one that has your PowerPoint.
So actually on my side, it says the PowerPoint I selected is being shared. So I'm not sure if you guys are seeing a different.
Sohail, I'll do it from here.
Sure, sounds great. Thank you, Professor. Sorry about that.
No problem.
Perfect. Thank you for being patient. These things happen. Sorry about it. So to start, hi everyone. My name is Sohail Shahid Mia. I'm a PhD candidate at Ryerson University, and I'm studying policy studies, more specifically immigration, settlement, diaspora stream. Professor Ghosh, do you mind just going on to the second? Yes. So the chapter title, the chapter that myself and Professor Ghosh and Professor Garrison that are planning to write about is a collaboration. You know, it's a development chapter that came through a discussion between all three authors that are mentioned in this, and I will briefly mention them as we are going through it. So the title that we are thinking of possibly proposing for this chapter, it is called Hearing the Untold: Methodological Challenges of a Social Resilience Approach to Studying International Students. Obviously, this is a working title. As we progress with the chapter, this may be this may subject to a change, but for now, this is what we are proposing. And the reason why we said hearing the untold, which I will explain briefly now and also later on throughout the presentation, is that hearing the untold basically means that we are trying to go beyond what the participants are saying and sharing with us. We are taking the interpretive approach to really understand what the participants are sharing with us and going beyond what they share with us. In terms of just a little bit more background information, so you can see how I will be relevant to the study, is that I used to be an international student and I did my BA in law at Laurentian University, which is a university at the city of Greater Sudbury. I worked for a few years, then I moved to Toronto and I did my master in criminology from University of Toronto, also as an international student. So just having that experience, just experiencing being an international student in a small city and in a large city kind of like gives me that insider I guess perspective that I can bring to this paper or to this chapter, which later on throughout the next slide I will reflect more on that. In terms of the authors, obviously, just briefly introducing them. Professor Ghosh, I'm sure some of you are familiar with Professor Ghosh. She is the associate professor at Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at Ryerson University. It is myself and Professor Raymond Garrison, who is also a professor at the faculty in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at Ryerson University. And he does have, he comes with 13 years of experience in research design, qualitative data collection and analysis, primarily in telephone interviewing. So we thought, you know, having him on this chapter would be a great addition in terms of studying the methodological challenges related to international students. Professor Ghosh, would you? Thank you. So in terms of the chapter plan, obviously, in terms of the limitation, it's supposed to be about 5,000 words max. We have divided the chapter into 5 different sections, with the exception that the learning from the field will be subdivided into 2 sections. So in terms of the introduction, so far, obviously, these are subject to change if one part a little bit have more information than the others. But in terms of the introduction, what we are planning to hopefully write about in this chapter is that we are trying to find out what is social resilience, what are the indicators of social resilience, and how social resilience is measured and examined in further detail. So hopefully we can capture that in our introduction. In terms of the literature review, obviously this is the part that is one of the key parts of this chapter. We are trying to focus on the reflexive methodologies in social science. Pretty much more specifically, how is it similar or different from data collection methods commonly used in grounded theory or ethnomethodology. We will be also discussing the data-driven versus data-centered approaches in documenting the experiences of immigrants, more specifically, what works, where, and why methodological approaches used in documenting social resilience. And that one we are trying to dedicate about 1,500 words. In terms of learning from the field, also, we are dedicating about 1,500 words, but this is the section that it will be divided to 2 parts. The first part, it will be 2 studies that will be compared. Both studies use primarily telephone interviewing. The first study, if it was completed, it is already completed, and it focused on the Indian international students in GTA colleges. More specifically, this project was funded by BMRC During this project, we wanted to do focus groups and follow-up interviews, but due to the COVID-19 and the circumstances that have arisen as a result of COVID-19, we had the method of the data collection had to be changed, and telephone interviews were conducted with 30 Indian international students attending GTA colleges. In terms of the second study, which is still ongoing, we just started it. It is focusing on the challenges and resiliency of international students and institutions in northern communities, more specifically in medium-sized cities such as the city of Greater Sudbury. So this is the study that we are trying to understand more about the resiliency and the struggles and the challenges that international students face during the COVID-19, and see what are the shortcomings, what are the policy recommendations, and how as researchers we are able to hopefully shed some lights on that perspective. For this study, we are interviewing 80 participants using a telephone interviewing, again, because of the COVID-19 situation. 60 of these participants will be international students, and we are aiming to interview students that hopefully there are some French and there are some English, because we are thinking that, you know, international students and French international students, they may go through a different set of challenges regarding COVID-19. That's why our study is trying to capture both groups. And again, the interviews will be conducted both in English and in French as well. Then the second part of the learning from the field, it will focus on the methodological challenges. More specifically, it will focus on the questionnaire design, such as clues and insights based on what we are learning from the students and what we are changing and how we are changing the probing method. It will focus on the interviewing. The telephone interviewing, sometimes, as you may know, it is difficult because it doesn't give you that advantage of really seeing the expression and the body language of the, I guess, interviewees that you are interviewing in order to get a better understanding of what they are going through. And also, we are focusing on those being an insider help. So if you recall, I did mention that I briefly mentioned my background, and I said that I can be an insider to this chapter. And this is where we are trying to see if being an insider help. And we believe that, you know, when things are sometimes not told directly by the people that we interview them, being the insider, having that insider experience may become helpful, and be able, also the things that we went through, we may be able to use them to kind of better interview the students and the institutions that we are planning to use for this study. We can so obviously for this project, because we are saying the hearing the untold, we are trying to use the interpretive approach to really understand what the students are going through. In this respect, keeping field diaries is very important, and it becomes an essential component of these chapters. So that's why we try to write notes about the participants as we progress and as we move forward. The fourth section, it will be obviously discussion and recommendations, where we are thinking about allocating about 750 words, where it's pretty much a summary of everything of the chapter that already will be written about. And then obviously we will end the chapter with the conclusion remarks. Professor Kashi, if you don't mind, please going to the next slide. So far, this is the way that we plan that the author contributions will be going on. In terms of the introduction, we have dedicated this section to Professor Gash, and she will be responsible in terms of the introduction. The literature review we dedicated to Professor Garrison because, as I mentioned, he comes with 13 years of experience in methodological challenges and in terms of the interviewing, using telephone interviewing. So he has a great experience to add it to this chapter. In terms of learning from the fields, which I mentioned, it will be subdivided into two parts. It will be dedicated to myself and Professor Gash. And in terms of the discussion and conclusions, all three authors will contribute. Obviously, the order of the authorship will be subject to the contributions of the authors and how much they will contribute to the chapter, and is subject to change. But for now, we are, as I mentioned in the first part, it will be Professor Gash, myself, and Professor Garrison. But again, it's subject to change. Yes, so this is what we are planning to do and what we are planning to discuss in terms of this chapter on the methodological challenges regarding international students. So this is where I'm going to stop, and please feel free to ask any questions or any part that you think is not clear. We also have Professor Gash as a participant. So if there is something that she will be able to assist in answering your questions, I'm sure she will be more than happy to answer your questions as well. Thank you so much for your time.
That was great. Thank you so much, Sohail, for that presentation. I'm really looking forward to seeing the results of the research when you guys are finished and are able to put it together. I'd like to open up to questions now, and I'm going to pick the last comment that was put into the chat to start. I think it takes us up to a very high level, some of the big themes that are coming out of this, the various presentations today. For me, it was put in the chat by Valerie. She says, thanks, Chris. Can you say more about the impacts of the urban context? I see a link to Chedley's comments about Montreal, where he emphasizes the disparity between branding and the reality of high housing costs, limited services, etc. And I would also bring that up even kind of one level further to, you know, there's, I think, a connection I'm hearing in all of these conversations around this disparity between the branding and the reality of how a city is or isn't welcoming of international students, the type of lifestyle and opportunities that it presents to international students. But also, if we just think about kind of the development of immigration policy in Canada and the branding of international students, and I think this came up when Christina was speaking around international students being touted as a solution to everything, you know, the ideal immigrants, and the disparity between this, if this is the reality, and such a focus on bringing in more international students, and then the disparity with, and then how the immigration system and services and supports in the country are then set up to support them to become permanent residents and immigrants. I would open it up to any of you to comment on that. Those are big questions, but.
So I don't know if Chris.
You can go ahead.
No, I mean, there are big questions, and I don't know if I have the answer, and the observation that you're making are in a way what started the research in Montreal was maybe this observation that two things. First, the branding. I mean, the way this machine, this industry was working, and the way we promote Montreal, and even doing interviews with key stakeholders, there's this vocabulary is coming out, and it's a fact, and it's something that we showed in our research. And the other one was on the other side, on the ground. You have in a neighborhood, you have a big university where I work, Concordia. You have a lot of international students living in the neighborhood, and you also have citizens concerned citizens talking in this Peter McGill neighborhood of immigration issues, of trying to understand what is happening in the neighborhood, and also realizing that there is no connections between some of these key issues, and that was also something that, for me, when I came at Concordia 7-8 years ago. Before that, I was teaching in a smaller context, smaller university, and looking at this neighborhood where you realize that people were not even collaborating or talking to each other to understand what was the reality on the ground. So the branding really up there high, and then the fact that the reality can be sometimes quite different. So,
yeah.
Je sais pas, Amel, si j'ai dit des bêtises, tu me corriges.
Maybe Christina, if you want to add on this, but yes, I will probably have some words to say to
You could
complete.
go ahead. Go
Yeah.
ahead, Amel. Yeah.
So yeah, Shadley point out so the outlines of the paper. It was a snapshot of the situation in 2018, and he also point more recent trends in this presentation, but those trends were like anticipated in the paper. I will explain myself. But yeah, I would like to add a comment on the discussion started by Valerie Preston and Luisa Veronis in the chat. It's actually interesting questions that I'm trying to push further. The paper wrote with Shadley was like an exploration of this big questions. So as he told, yes, there's a gap, an important gap between the discourse and all the so the imagery and what we attend as a metropolis attracting newcomers and the situations and experiences on the ground. So this is general outlines, but regarding the cohabitation of international students in certain areas, such as in downtown, where they live more densely, maybe you have some readings on the literature on studentification. So it's instructive, but we know very little about urban dynamics and lifestyles carried by international students in particular. So when we talk about studentification and the densification of certain neighborhoods by students, we do not point out the reality brought by international students and temporary young migrants specifically. So yeah, it's an interesting point that maybe we can push further. So yeah, and what can I say more here? Maybe both the model, you were talking about hospitality. In my point of view, both the model of welcoming community and researchers on hospitality take as their subjects populations that are a priori precarious due to the nature of their migratory situation. The case of students, you told, yeah, they're considered by many as guests of honor. They're a category à part, is very different, and therefore gives rise to an analysis, sorry, that are, from my point of view, quite original when we're interested in the hospitality concept or approach to new migrants. Here, what I would like to say about that is we see that welcoming and hospitality practices toward this population is now possible only at a certain price. So this is not a conception of hospitality or welcoming that is like generous, I would say. This is not a generous or without any, we're not, how can I say that? It's not, on ne le fait pas pour aucune raison.
Amel en français, si vous voulez.
Oh, ouais, c'est ça, c'est des raisons donc qui donc plus commerciales. Donc there's when we look at the literature on hospitality with commercial purposes,
Yeah.
we read the situation or the welcoming of international students really clearly.
Mhm.
So this is a little bit what I want to say. I will have many other things to to add, but I want to hear from you too. So yeah, so there's many stakeholders, but I would like to know maybe the private market in different so les différentes filières ou sector of
Right.
activities
Right.
in your different cities. So yeah.
I think this is a really interesting reflection, the correlation between hospitality in a private sector setting and the welcoming of international students. Christina, I'd like you to invite you to comment anything on this if you would like, and then we have just a few more minutes.
Just quickly, on the issue of hospitality, there is, I'm trying to think back, but there is a thing about hospitality insofar as who has the power to extend the invitation or to be hospitable, and who is receiving it. And there is a whole dynamic of power in there. It's just a different, maybe a different take at that question. On the issue of branding, I think it's quite interesting, the broader issue of branding, both cities such as Montreal, or even more broadly, if we're thinking about the immigration system and the way in which Canada brands itself in terms of immigration and the use of postgraduate work permits as a tool. And as the research for many of us indicate, that students cannot access postgraduate permits very easily, but they are used as a magnet to attract students to come to Canada. On the other side of that, though, on branding and thinking about some of the research here in Ottawa, one of the students' experiences of being in Ottawa, and she was a student with origins in Africa whose parents lived in Scandinavia, in one of the Scandinavian countries, and was now a student here. Her experience of racism in the country where her parents live was quite profound and quite overt. And in Ottawa, that was not her experience, that was not the case. And so for her, this was a reason she would choose to live in Ottawa, because of her everyday experience. And I thought that was quite interesting. The other thing, Ottawa brands itself as a technology capital of Canada, software and this and that, much of which I'm unfamiliar with. But one of the students said, who was pursuing a PhD in that area, said he wasn't sure he would stay in Ottawa because he didn't think it was particularly innovative in that respect, and that sector was quite small. And he had other options, and he saw himself moving out of the country. So it's very much one's experience on the ground contradicting some of these narratives that maybe cities or countries like to tell themselves, and members of those cities and countries maybe like to believe, but it's not always the case.
Thank you. Those were really interesting reflections. We are 1 minute away from what is supposed to be the end of our session today. We had one more specific and targeted question in the comments, and Sutama had offered to respond to that. Can I ask you to do that very quickly, Sutama, before I wrap us up for today?
Yeah, thank you. So all I wanted to say is that for the previous study, sorry, I'm not showing my, oh, maybe I could, I don't know. Anyway, for my previous study, which was on international students attending private and career colleges in the GTA, one of the things we understood is that we started by, we had asked that we are going to do focus groups, but after 2 focus groups, we realized 2 things, that international students were not very upfront or not rather interested even to come for focus groups for a variety of reasons, not just their time commitment and work commitments, but also they were not very upfront about sharing information. So that was one of the things that I have learned. And then of course COVID came, so we did the telephone interviews. So thankfully in our ethics we had already said that we are going to do the follow-up interviews, so we did not have to take another ethics clearance, which took about a lot of time. But anywho, when we were doing the telephone interviews, we saw that switching to one's home language, if that is possible, does give that opportunity. And so what we have done for this research in particular is that I have, of course, Sohail speaks Farsi, and I speak a few Indian languages, but we've also hired research assistants who will speak these various languages and can switch between English, French, and those languages. And that is only one thing I can share for now, but there are other issues that we can talk about, particularly with respect to what they did not tell us, and how do we go about finding those by using particular probes and sort of saying that I've been there. Those kind of things were helpful. I don't know, we are still planning how to write this up because it is a challenge for us, but I think that will be helpful for practitioners and academics, hopefully.
Thank you so much, Sutama, for sharing that. I think that's some really important points to take away from the work that you've been doing. We are a few minutes over time now, and I'm sure that everybody is very busy. We all have so many Zoom meetings scheduled every day, so I will wrap us up now. I'd like to thank all three of our presenters today for sharing the results of the research that you've done so far. It's been a really interesting and informative discussion today, and this is a really important topic for many communities across Canada. I'd like to thank everybody else who came and participated in the chat and just came out of interest to hear some of the research that's been happening. This is the second in a series of at least 6 webinars that are happening. And we have the next one is happening next week at the same time. For those who are interested, it will be focused on families as a source of resilience. So we'd invite you all to join us again next Wednesday and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Sarah.
everyone.